The snow fell gently from the dark sky like tiny feathers, soft but endless. It was one of those winter mornings when everything looked white and still, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind was sharp, carrying the kind of cold that slipped through every crack and touched even the warmest heart. In the middle of a quiet countryside stood a small farmhouse with a red roof, the only spot of color in a land covered in white. That was Walter's home. Walter was an old farmer. His hands were rough from years of working with the soil, and his back had a small bend from carrying heavy sacks and walking through the fields every day. He lived alone in the farmhouse that had once been full of laughter, the smell of fresh bread and the voices of children. Now it was quiet, too quiet sometimes. His wife Martha had passed away many years ago, and their 2 children had moved to cities far away. They called sometimes, but phone calls were never the same as warm hugs and noisy dinners. Every morning Walter woke up before the sun. He had done that for as long as he could remember. It didn't matter if it was summer or winter. The farm never waited. That morning when the first pale light touched the snow, he slowly sat up in bed. His room was cold and his breath made small clouds in the air. He put on his thick wool sweater, wrapped a scarf around his neck, and stepped into his worn boots that had seen many winters. The old wooden floor creaked as he walked into the kitchen. He lit the fire in the small stove and filled the kettle with water. As the water heated, he looked out the window. The fields were white and silent, and even the trees seemed frozen. A soft sadness always touched him on mornings like this. He loved the farm, but the silence sometimes felt like it was pressing on his chest. Walter made himself a cup of tea, the same way he had done for years, and sat at the old kitchen table. The chair across from him was empty, as it always was. Once Martha used to sit there. She would hum softly while he drank his tea. Sometimes she would talk about the day ahead. He missed that more than he could ever say. After finishing his tea, Walter put on his thick coat and stepped outside. The wind immediately hit his face, sharp and cold. He pulled his scarf tighter around his neck and walked toward the small barn to check on the animals. His boots crunched in the snow with each step. The world around him was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing. He fed the hens first. They were huddled together, their feathers fluffed up to keep warm. Then he gave hay to the cow and checked the fence to make sure nothing had broken in the night. As he walked back to the house, something caught his eye, a small dark shape near the gate. At first, he thought it might be a pile of snow or a fallen branch. But as he got closer, he saw it wasn't. It was a person. Walter's heart jumped a little. He hadn't seen anyone near his farm in days. The roads were dangerous in this kind of weather, and most people stayed inside their homes. He hurried forward, his boots sinking into the snow. Lying on the ground by the gate was a woman. She was curled up on her side, wearing a thin coat that was soaked through with melting snow. Her hair was wet and her lips were pale. "Good heavens," Walter whispered under his breath. He knelt down beside her. She was breathing, but weakly. Her hands were trembling. Her eyes were closed, and she looked exhausted, as if she had been fighting the cold for hours. "Miss?" Walter said gently, trying not to startle her. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open a little. They were soft brown and full of fear and confusion. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her lips only moved silently. "Don't try to talk," Walter said kindly. "You're freezing. Let's get you inside." Even though he was old, Walter was still strong. Years of farming had kept his arms and legs firm. He carefully lifted the woman in his arms. She was light, as if the cold had taken away all her strength. He carried her through the snow, opened the farmhouse door with his elbow, and stepped inside. The warmth from the stove wrapped around them like a soft blanket. Walter laid her gently on the couch near the fire. She was still shivering, her teeth lightly knocking together. He ran to the hallway, grabbed one of his thickest blankets, and covered her from shoulders to feet. Then he filled a kettle with hot water and made a cup of tea with honey. The smell of it spread through the small house, mixing with the scent of burning wood. The woman slowly opened her eyes wider. She looked around, confused but no longer frightened. Walter smiled gently. "You're safe," he told her. "You're in my home. It's all right." She tried to sit up, but her hands were stiff from the cold. Walter helped her sit against a pillow. She held the warm cup with both hands, even though they were still shaking. The heat seemed to bring some life back to her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and tired. "You don't need to thank me. Walter replied. Anyone would have done the same. She gave a weak smile. Her cheeks were slowly turning pink again as the warmth spread through her body. She looked like she was in her early 30s, maybe younger. Her coat was worn and her boots were soaked. I was driving to the next town, she said slowly. The storm started. My car slid off the road. I thought I could walk for help, but... She shook her head. I didn't think the cold would be this strong. Walter listened carefully. You're lucky you made it this far, he said. If I hadn't come outside... He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what he meant. Her eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from relief. I was so scared, she admitted softly. Walter gently placed another log on the fire. The flames grew brighter, throwing soft orange light across the room. You're safe now, he said again. The storm is still bad outside, but you can stay here until it's over. The woman nodded slowly. Thank you. I'm Clara, she said after a moment. Walter gave a small smile. Walter, he replied. Just Walter. The clock on the wall ticked softly as the storm continued outside. Snow beat against the windows, but inside the farmhouse it was warm and quiet. Clara sipped her tea slowly, and Walter sat in the chair near the fire, his hands resting on his knees. He hadn't had another person in his home in years, but somehow it didn't feel strange. It felt right. As Clara's strength returned, she told him a little more. She had been on her way to visit her sick mother in a nearby town. She didn't want to wait until the storm passed because she was worried about her mother's health. When the snow began to fall harder, she tried to drive carefully, but her car slid off the narrow road into a shallow ditch. She had tried calling for help, but there was no signal in that part of the countryside, so she decided to walk. She thought the farmhouse light she saw in the distance was just a street lamp. She hadn't known it would lead to someone kind. Walter listened to every word. Her voice was soft but full of emotion. She wasn't just cold. She had been alone and frightened. He knew that feeling too well. As the night went on, Walter made her some warm soup. The smell filled the kitchen, making the house feel alive again. Clara smiled faintly as she ate, grateful beyond words. Walter couldn't help but notice the way her smile lit up the room. It wasn't loud or bright, but it was warm, and it made something stir in his heart, something he hadn't felt in a long time. After dinner, Clara fell asleep on the couch, wrapped tightly in the blanket. Her breathing was steady now, peaceful. Walter sat quietly in his chair, watching the fire. The light flickered across the walls and the wind howled outside, but he didn't feel as alone as he usually did. He thought about how strange life could be. One moment he was just living another quiet morning, and the next a stranger had appeared at his gate. A stranger who had needed him and, without even knowing it, had already changed something in his heart. He pulled another blanket over her shoulders and whispered softly, "Sleep well, Clara." Then he sat back in his chair and listened to the fire crackle. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, for the first time in years, there was warmth. Not just from the fire, but from the quiet presence of another human being. Walter didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but something deep inside told him that this was not just a random winter morning. This was the beginning of something new. The morning sun rose slowly, spilling soft golden light across the white fields. The storm had finally stopped. The snow on the roof sparkled like crystals, and the air outside was cold but calm. Inside the farmhouse, the fire had burned low, but the room was still warm. Walter sat in his chair with a blanket over his knees, watching the flames dance quietly. Clara was still asleep on the couch, wrapped in the thick wool blanket. Her face no longer looked pale, and her breathing was steady. For a long moment, Walter just watched her sleep. He didn't know why, but something about the sight made his heart feel lighter. It had been so many years since another person had spent the night in his home. When she finally opened her eyes, she blinked at the sunlight pouring through the window. For a second, she seemed unsure of where she was. Then she saw Walter sitting there with a gentle smile, and everything came back to her. "Good morning," he said softly. Clara sat up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "Good morning," she replied, her voice quiet but stronger than the night before. "I can't believe I'm still here," Walter chuckled. "Well, the storm wasn't going to let you leave last night," he said. "But you're safe now." She looked at him with warm eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You probably saved my life." Walter shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what anyone should do. But Clara knew not everyone would have opened their door to a stranger in the middle of a snowstorm. She felt a wave of gratitude that was hard to put into words. Walter stood and walked into the kitchen. "Are you hungry?" he asked over his shoulder. "I can make some porridge. It's not fancy, but it'll warm you up." She laughed softly. "That sounds perfect." As he cooked, the smell of oats and cinnamon filled the house. Clara looked around the room and noticed the small details. The wooden shelves with old photos, the faded blue curtains, the old clock ticking on the wall. It wasn't a big house, but it felt warm, safe, and full of quiet stories. When Walter brought the bowls of porridge to the table, Clara joined him. They sat across from each other just like old friends. She hadn't expected to feel this kind of comfort in a stranger's home. Over breakfast, she told him more about her life. She worked as a nurse in the city. Her mother had been sick for a while, and when she heard the storm was coming, she didn't want to wait. She wanted to reach her mother's house in the next town before it got worse, but the storm had arrived faster than she expected. Walter listened carefully, nodding slowly. He liked listening to her talk. Her voice was warm and honest, and he could see how much she loved her mother. When she finished, he shared a little about himself. He told her about the farm, about how he had lived there all his life. He spoke of Martha, his wife, and how they had built everything together. The house, the barn, the garden. He spoke with a gentle smile, though there was a quiet sadness in his eyes. He told her how their children had moved far away for work, and how he spent most of his days alone with the animals and the land. Clara listened with great attention. She could feel the weight of the years in his voice, not heavy but real. "Doesn't it get lonely?" she asked softly. Walter looked out the window at the snowy fields. "Yes," he said honestly. "Sometimes it does. But the land is my home. I can't imagine living anywhere else." There was a short silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people simply understand each other without needing too many words. Later that morning, Clara went outside to check her car. It was half buried in snow and the engine wouldn't start. Walter offered to help. They worked together for nearly an hour, clearing snow from around the tires and checking under the hood. Their breaths made little white clouds in the cold air. Walter found the problem quickly. The battery had died in the freezing night. "You're not going anywhere today," he said kindly. "We'll get it fixed, but it might take some time." Clara wasn't upset. In fact, a small part of her was relieved. She wasn't ready to leave just yet. Back inside, she helped Walter around the house. She washed the dishes after breakfast, and he showed her how to collect wood for the fire. They laughed when she nearly tripped over a bucket in the barn. She wasn't used to country life, but Walter liked how she didn't complain once. As the day went on, the two of them talked more. Clara told stories about the hospital where she worked, about the people she met, the little moments of kindness that made the hard days worth it. Walter shared stories from the past, about raising animals, planting fields, and the way the seasons shaped his life. Each story brought a smile or a soft laugh. Slowly, the house that had once felt too quiet began to feel alive again. When the sun started to set, the sky turned a deep orange, and the fields glowed softly. Walter made a simple dinner, soup and bread. Clara helped chop the vegetables, and they cooked together like two people who had done it for years. As they ate by the fire, Clara felt something warm inside her chest. She had been so tired, so worried the night before. But now, sitting in this little farmhouse, everything felt strangely peaceful. Walter noticed the way she smiled more easily now. She wasn't shivering anymore. Her cheeks had color again. He realized how much he had enjoyed the day, the conversations, the laughter, the feeling of not being alone. Before going to sleep that night, Clara said softly, "I think I was meant to find this place." Walter looked at her with gentle eyes. "And maybe I was meant to open the gate," he replied. The next morning, a neighbor came by with a small truck and helped them start Clara's car. The roads were clearer now. It was time for her to continue her journey. As she packed her bag, a small sadness filled the house again. Neither of them wanted to say goodbye too quickly. At the gate where he had found her, Walter stood beside her car. The air was cold again, but the sky was blue. Clara held his hand tightly for a moment. "I'll never forget what you did for me," she said sincerely. "You gave me warmth when I had none. You made a stranger feel safe," Walter smiled. "You gave me something too," he said. "Company, laughter, I hadn't had that in a long time. She got into her car, but before she drove off, she rolled down the window. "I'll come back," she said. "I promise," Walter nodded slowly. "I'll be here." She drove away, leaving tracks in the snow. Walter watched until her car disappeared down the long white road. The farmhouse was quiet again, but it felt different now. It didn't feel as empty. There was something warm inside his heart, something he hadn't felt in years. Days turned into weeks. One afternoon, as Walter was mending a fence near the barn, he heard the sound of a car. He turned and saw a familiar figure stepping out, Clara with a big smile and a basket in her hand. She had kept her promise. From that day on, Clara visited often. Sometimes she brought her mother, who loved the countryside. Sometimes she came alone just to sit with Walter and drink tea. Slowly, their lives began to weave together, not in a dramatic way, but in a gentle, steady rhythm. Walter found himself laughing more, talking more, and feeling less alone. Clara found a place where she could breathe away from the noise of the city. They didn't need to say much to understand how special their bond had become. Years of silence had lived in that farmhouse, but it took one cold winter morning, one act of kindness, and one stranger at the gate to bring life back into it. Their story was not about grand promises or loud moments. It was about two lonely hearts who found warmth in each other's company. And sometimes that kind of quiet connection is the most powerful of all.